Welcome to another episode of 11 Warriors Live. It's been a couple of weeks since we've talked to you, but I'm joined as always by Dan Hope and Andy Anders. I'm your host, Chase Brown, and we have a quarterfinals matchup set for Ohio State. Ohio State is going to face Miami in the Cotton Bowl on December 31st, New Year's Eve, the first of the quarterfinals matchups. And guys, I don't really know what to say about the game that occurred at Kyle Field in College Station between Texas A&M and Miami. It certainly wasn't the game that I expected to watch. I guess I shouldn't say the one I expected. I don't know what I expected, but I certainly didn't see this game ending in a 10-3 result for Miami. I don't know. Did you guys feel the same? Andy, I know that you were preparing for Ohio State to play North Carolina on Saturday, but Dan, you were watching the game from start to finish. In your estimation, what was this matchup and what should Ohio State fans take away from this game now that we are 10 days away from that matchup between Ohio State and Miami?
Yeah, I think it was a very sloppy performance, really, offensively and on special teams for both teams. I mean, Texas A&M made a lot of special teams errors, and then I think Miami's kicker, what did he miss? Free field goals. So that contributed a significant deal to the low scoring in this game. But I think it was clear that both defenses were ahead of the offense in this game. Really the only real long drives we saw. I mean, there was the Texas A&M had one long pass early in the game, and then kicker missed a chip shot field goal, and then really the last two drives of the game, Miami has a 56-yard run by Mark Fletcher, sets up the touchdown run by Malachi Toney, and then Texas A&M drives back down the field, but Marcel Reed throws a pick in the red zone to Bryce Fitzgerald, who had two picks in this game. So, I think you probably come out of this game as an Ohio State fan thinking, well, if Miami could only score 10 against Texas A&M, we feel pretty good about what Matt Patricia's defense can do against this Miami offense, considering Ohio State's defense has been the best defense in the country this year. I think on the other side of the ball, I think Miami's defense can present some challenges, particularly to pass rush. Miami had 7 sacks yesterday. So for an Ohio State team coming off a rough performance in pass protection against Indiana, I think that's certainly a big key you're going to circle for this game is protecting Julian Sayin, limiting the damage that Miami's pass rush can do because they do have a really good pass rush led by Ruben Bain Jr. But I think there's reason to be confident if you're an Ohio State fan based on how much Miami's offense struggled yesterday.
Yeah, it seemed like Miami also did a really good job stuffing the run. Texas A&M in this game had 35 attempts with only 89 yards. It's 2.5 a pop. Some of the Marcel Reed sacks certainly come to be a factor in that. But it did seem like Miami also did a good job in that regard. That defensive front's going to be something that Ohio State fans are going to have to watch out for. I was surprised a little bit by the environment maybe not playing as much of a factor in this game. I think that kind of has to do with the game script. It's very much the 12th man is a little bit like when you're playing at Ohio Stadium. There's 100,000+ people in the stadium, but when the team isn't playing that well, that's 100,000 people who are on your side to 100,000 people where you could hear a pin drop in the stadium based on what happens in the game. So Miami to be able to go into that environment and to have a performance that wasn't its best, but a performance that was enough to get the job done, I think maybe gives them some confidence coming into this Cotton Bowl as well, is that they were able to go into a road environment, one that's considered one of the best in college football, and kind of take away that chain a little bit. Was it Miami that had the turnover chain a couple of years ago? They started that trend,
Yeah.
or maybe they were the first one to kind of revolutionize it. So they were able to go into Texas A&M and snatch that chain. They took over the trap, Andy, as it said. What was your perspective of the game, Andy, as you were kind of multitasking a little bit between basketball and football there toward the end?
No, I had. I mean, that game was at noon, so toward the end it was like third quarter. I was getting myself ready to. To me, it was a gorgeous master when it comes to a football game. To that amount of sloppiness and hilarity, but then just like defenses dominating. Um, I expected a low scoring outing coming into the game. I thought both offenses had shown some inconsistency in the past. Their quarterbacks had ups and downs and certainly didn't have their best outings in this last game. And so I think Ohio State, you go into this with, I would say I'm more confident now in Ohio State's ability to beat Miami, just because I think their defense is going to be able to do a lot of the same things the Texas A&M's did. Now, by the same token, I will say it was a big performance from Junior, probably his career. That running game did get going, which I think was one of the deciding factors. Certainly on that go-ahead scoring drive, he had runs of I think 56 and 12 yards. So great story there. Guy who was a former Ohio State commit, but a lifelong Miami fan. His family was a lifelong Miami fans. His dad tragically passed last year. Sudden, it was sudden. Um, so that's a cool story to watch coming into this one with Mark Fletcher. But I think Ohio State's defense, Texas A&M's defense is elite. Ohio State's is like the creme de la creme in the country. And so it's going to come down to the trenches. It always does, especially when you're talking to me. Uh, I think whichever offensive line can hold up the best against the opposing defensive line is going to have a really good chance to win this game based on what I saw on Saturday because this Miami defensive front is so dangerous. Uh, and the Ohio State defensive front. I mean, if they can pressure Texas A&M got after Carson Beck quite a bit too. If they can pressure him in a similar way, it's also going to be tough for Miami to move the ball.
And I would just add to that, like to a point about confidence in Ohio State's defense. I don't know, but I would say Texas A&M's defense is great. I mean, you look at their numbers from the year. They gave up 40 points to Notre Dame, 42 points to Arkansas, 30 points to South Carolina, 27 points to Texas. So I don't think that Miami ran into some defensive buzzsaw yesterday. I think one number in particular that stood out to me was watching Miami's struggles in the red zone. I looked this up, and Texas A&M is 127th out of 136 teams this year in terms of red zone scores allowed percentage, 32 out of 35. And so if Miami's offense is not significantly better in the red zone than it was in this past game, I like Ohio State's defense's chances of stopping Miami from scoring a lot of touchdowns because Ohio State's defense has been the best red zone defense in the country this year. Now, red zone offense might be another story for Ohio State, but red zone defense has been elite for the Buckeyes. I mean, defense has been elite in all areas for the Buckeyes, and so I think that Ohio State's defense is significantly better than Texas A&M's defense. Texas A&M has a really good pass rush, but I think the rest of their defense has not necessarily been elite this year, and so I think that for Miami to struggle as much as it did offensively against Texas A&M gives you a lot of confidence, but it's also a different game. Like just because Miami's offense had one bad game against Texas A&M does not mean that they're going to have another bad game against Ohio State. It's going to be different environment, like you said. It was a road game, even if but Miami ultimately won the game. They were still playing on the road. They were also playing in a lot of wind in that game. This quarterfinal game at the Cotton Bowl will be played indoors on turf at an NFL stadium. And so, some of the kicking issues that we saw yesterday in that game, you wouldn't think would be as much of an issue in this environment, though. Obviously, Ohio State fans know that, kicking inside in a dome doesn't guarantee any success based on what we saw in the Big Ten championship game. But, different factors at play, which could allow Miami certainly to have a better day offensively against Ohio State than it did against Texas A&M. But based on what Ohio State's defense has been this year and what Texas A&M's defense has been this year, I think you certainly have a lot of confidence in Ohio State's defense going into this matchup.
And a different game and also a different mindset too. I know Ryan Day, back when we talked to him most recently, which was soon after Ohio State had lost to Indiana in the Big Ten championship game, he immediately pointed out to Ohio State needing to be focused and ready for this quarterfinals game because of what happened in last year's quarterfinals matchups. Ohio State was one of those teams that came out and just boat raced Oregon, the number one seed, undefeated, in the Rose Bowl because in many ways he attributes that to Oregon not really being able to generate any momentum after that Big Ten championship game. Ohio State had the benefit of beating up on Tennessee to then go into the Rose Bowl. all of these teams that just played on Friday and Saturday had the opportunity to play a game, to understand what it's like to play playoff football. And last year, as an example, there's a little bit here where you kind of have to chalk it up maybe to where the way the format looked last year, because Boise State was the number 3 seed, Arizona State was the number 4 seed, but still number 6 Penn State beats number 3 Boise State, number 5 Texas beats number 4 Arizona State. Obviously, Ohio State beats Oregon, and then number 7 Notre Dame beat number 2 Georgia. So in all of those quarterfinals matchups last year, though the spread probably favored some of those lower seeded teams, it was in every matchup the lower seeded team that beat the higher seeded one. So I'm sure that Ohio State is going to have plenty of things that they're going to point to that Miami didn't do well in this game, but they also are going, as you're saying, Dan, to point to this is an entirely new game. This is an entirely new set of circumstances, an entirely new stadium, all these different things. However, I would say, and I think this is an important thing to note going into the matchup, Ohio State is a double-digit favorite in this matchup. They opened somewhere around 8.5, 9.5 last week going into the game. Obviously, we all watched this game between Miami and Texas A&M that has then shifted the line. I don't know where the consensus has necessarily fallen because it seems like it's pretty spread even still to this point. Somewhere between 9.5 to 12.5 points is where you're going to see that line depending on the sports book. It'll probably end up being a consensus around 10.5. And that is going to be probably where that line ends up settling over the next 10 days. There could be some things that change depending on who's available and who's not. And I'm not hinting at anything injury wise for Ohio State or Miami there, just saying that that could be something that changes the lines. But we're probably going to end up with this being a double digit favorite for Ohio State. Where, if you are looking at this matchup currently, Dan, do you see that matchup or that line trending? Would you take Miami to cover those 10.5 points, or would you take Ohio State to cover the 10.5 right now?
I would take Ohio State to cover right now because, again, because I think you think about what Ohio State's defense has been this year. You think about the offensive struggles Miami had yesterday. I wouldn't think. I feel like if Ohio State's defense plays the way it's played all year, that Miami shouldn't score more than 14 points in this game. And so I do think that Ohio State's offense needs to have a bounce back performance from what we saw in the Big Ten championship game. But as I see it right now, I won't make a real score prediction until next week. But as I see it right now, I feel like Ohio State's offense is going to bounce back. I also feel like, based on what we saw in last year's CFP, I think Ohio State is going to pick up the offensive tempo here in the CFP and will play at a higher pace, which could lead to higher scoring games. So I would feel pretty good right now picking Ohio State to cover the spread. That's not to say that it's going to be an easy game, because no game is easy in the CFP, and there's still plenty of challenges ahead for Ohio State in this matchup. But I do feel like if Ohio State plays the way it's capable of, it should win this game by multiple scores.
Andy, is that how you view it as well?
Yes, I have Ohio State by multiple scores in this one. I think what Dan said, what we've talked about, how confident we feel in the defense, being able to shut down this Miami attack, and I think really you need multiple bona fide receiving threats if you're going to present any challenge to this secondary. Indiana, their wide receivers made a few big plays, namely Elijah Surratt, the touchdown catch that was ultimately the game winner for them. Um, what you have with Indiana was two elite receivers outside. Malachi Tony, it's unbelievable what he's done this year. Like, true freshman, almost 1,000 yards already. Not only a true freshman, he should be a high school senior right now. He reclassified and dropped in the recruiting rankings because of it. He only ended up 359th in the country for his class. Was a 3-star according to 24/7 Sports, and he's just exploded onto the scene. So you got to know where number 10 is, but the rest of the gamers, none of them have 600 yards. So year, and so when you got to take away, you take him away, you neutralize the ground game with what Mark Fletcher did in that last game, and I just feel really confident Ohio State's going to get a lot of stops, and with all the time that Ryan Day has had since the crazy week that was early signing day, Big Ten championship game, all this stuff that went on. Um, he's taken the to be able to focus on ball and to be able to focus on fixing the offense. With Brian Hartline, however much he's still involved with there's clearly some still has some attention on the head coaching job upcoming in South Florida. Still mixing it in here at Ohio State, trying to at least. Um, However much input comes from him, however much input comes from Keenan Bailey, however much input comes from Tyler Bowen. I think Ryan Day has this ability. He showed it last year in the college football playoff, and frankly, he's shown it in a lot of other postseason games in his career. Look back at Georgia 2022, what have you. He has that ability when he gets extra time to prepare for a game. The game plan that comes out and the level that the offense plays at relative to maybe where it was at the end of the season often takes a leap. And so for me, I think to win this game by multiple scores and cover the spread, 30 points will easily do that because I don't see Miami scoring certainly more than 17 against this defense. And so yeah, that's kind of where I'm standing at it right now. Like Dan, won't make my official prediction until a little later on, but I do see Ohio State winning by multiple scores.
I would probably pick the same. One thing I am thinking about that Miami will benefit from a little bit, maybe a lot. I don't tend to give Carson Beck some of the credit that he deserves, typically because in some of their biggest matchups, he tends to turn the ball over, costing his team the game. But I do believe his record against top ranked opponents is somewhere around 14-3 as a starter from his time at Miami and his time then more prominently at Georgia. So this is a guy who has experience in big time games. But I would also say that by and large, what we've seen from Ohio State's defense recently has been extremely vanilla because they haven't needed to really bring out all the stops to win a football game. They showed some of what they can do from a schematic perspective against Indiana and what was obviously a number one versus number two game. They didn't necessarily need to do anything too exotic to beat Michigan given the conditions and then given Bryce Underwood's capabilities as a quarterback. Caden Curry came out after that game and said that they just wanted to make Bryce Underwood play quarterback in that game and they felt comfortable that they could win. And then the games that were leading up to that had the likes of Purdue and UCLA and Rutgers. So I'm curious to see what Matt Patricia will bring out for an experienced quarterback in Carson Beck. I think you did see, as Dan mentioned at the very beginning of this episode, that Miami struggled in the red zone partially as many teams tend to do because the field shrinks. You're not able to get your weapons and your athletic pieces out in space as much as you would with more field available. But I do think that there's going to be some things that we'll see in this game that Matt Patricia is going to need to do, given Carson Beck's experience playing in an SEC conference that's had great teams over the years. And though he fell short in a couple of games, he's been somebody who completes the football at a high level. He's not at Julian Sains level in that regard, but when you looked at those statistics throughout the year, it was saying a pretty big gap and then a group of players that most often had Carson Beck among them. So he is somebody that can get the ball to his playmakers like Tony, as Andy mentioned, and then Mark Fletcher is somebody on the ground. So it definitely is a matchup that poses some challenges for Ohio State. Dana, you kind of mentioned this earlier, but I am curious to get maybe a little bit more of an in-depth look, even though we are 10 days away. What's one matchup in this game that you think Ohio State fans should be looking out for, that Ohio State fans should be keying in on over these next 10 days?
Yeah, I mean it's an obvious one, but I think certainly one that stands out is going to be a matchup between Ohio State's offensive line and Miami's edge rushers, namely Reuben Bain Jr. and Akeem Mesidor. Keontae Scott also, he's a guy who's kind of a versatile defensive back who moves all around the field. He had a monster game yesterday. I think he had been out with injury for a little bit, but he came back. He had free tackles for loss in yesterday's game. And so some players on that defense who can really get into the backfield, get after the quarterback. And, we saw Ohio State's offensive line really go from having its best performance of a season against Michigan to having its worst performance of a season against Indiana. And so that's going to be a big storyline going into this game is, does Ohio State's offensive line bounce back? We know there's some questions at that, right guard spot. Is Tegra Shabola even going to be available for this game? They've had, rotation going on there all year. Philip Daniels, I think, probably had one of his worst games of the season against Indiana. So can he bounce back in this game, in a game where he's probably going to find himself matched up with Ruben Bain Jr. quite often? So I think that's a huge matchup in this game. I mean, I think to me, like I go into this game feeling like if Ohio State's offensive line plays well, if Ohio State's offensive line can do what it needs to do and win the trenches, Ohio State's going to win this game. I think the recipe for Miami to pull the upset is if they can put a lot of pressure on Julian Sayin, get him out of his game, get Ohio State into bad spots where they get off schedule on offense. If they can get Ohio State out of its offensive rhythm and turn it into a low scoring game, Miami will certainly have a chance. I think that if Ohio State can protect Julian Sayin effectively, and Ohio State can get the passing game going with Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate, it should be a good day for the Buckeyes.
Andy, what's one matchup that you're looking for into this game?
Yeah, I think it's Ohio State's receivers against Miami's corners. For me, Ohio State could use a more explosive day from Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate. Not that they didn't have good Big Ten championship games, both made plays in that game. You certainly don't pin that loss on either of their performances. But the return to 100%, I don't 100%, certainly not against Michigan, but also not against. I think they was not just 10% didn't seem like they had fully recovered from Rutgers and Carnell Tate had been sidelined longer than that. And this Miami pass defense is good, number 10 in the country in passing yards per attempt allowed. They do some good things. They've got some good players. Second team All ACC at cornerback there, or well, Keontae Scott, second team All ACC. We mentioned the versatility that he could bring, and so I think the cornerbacks. It was said in the game against Texas A&M by the broadcasters, and I think it maybe came up a couple times where Texas A&M had some opportunities that they've been vulnerable to some deep shots this season. And so how does Miami account for the explosiveness of Carnell Tate and Jeremiah Smith? Where are they aligning their secondary? How are they trying? Can he get enough time to deliver those deep balls, right? Part of it comes together. If you want to attack downfield, you need time in the pocket. And so like Dan mentioned, it's important that you are able to protect him against this ferocious pass rush. So to me, that's one I really look at. It's probably one you look at in a lot of Ohio State games, given how great those two are at wide receiver. But to me, I think if both of them come bring it, and I expect both of them to do so, especially Jeremiah playing against his hometown team, school he was very much trying to flip him on National Signing Day, as we all remember back in 2023, the end of 2023. There, he's gonna. I expect a big game from Jeremiah. I think that's a big matchup to watch of them trying to get the passing game going and clicking the way it was at other portions of the year after Julian Sayin came under pressure. They didn't have as much sustained success against Indiana.
Jeremiah posted on Twitter X one of those purple small demon emojis after Miami had beaten Texas A&M, or maybe right as the game was about to go final. So I think he is certainly excited to play in this matchup against his hometown team. The questions about matchups answers one of the questions that our fans submitted in our comment section on the website. OSU Bias was asking about matchups, so I'll just use that as a nice transition into this next question from Brutus and Einhorn. If you want to submit questions into our live chats on YouTube and Facebook, please do. We will spend probably the next 10 or so minutes answering some of those questions. We'll wrap up our show kind of giving our CFP predictions from this point forward. But this one comes from Brutus and Einhorn. I'm curious, Dan, I'll start with you first, and I'll ask you the first half of this question. But the full question is this: who are the 1 to 2 players from our offense and defense that will have great performances against Miami due to matchups? I think Jeremiah Smith's maybe an obvious one. So give me two more beyond that. Who do you think are two offensive Buckeyes that could have great matchups and great games against Miami in the Cotton Bowl?
Yeah, I mean Jeremiah Smith certainly seems like the obvious one, just based on the way that everything's building up into this game. Not just the demon emoji. He also had a response a week or two ago after he lost the Bolitnikov award. So I think Jeremiah is certainly going to have a chip on his shoulder. I mean, you think back to last year going into the Tennessee game when he talked about how he was asking Brian Hartline to push him more. He wanted to get better going into the CFP, and then he goes out and has a monster game against Tennessee. So he's certainly one that I circle. I think another guy who's from Miami that I'm going to be watching for is just kind of a guy who Ohio State could really use a boost from. I think would be Brandon Inniss. Could this be a game going up against his hometown team, a team that he's acknowledged recruited him hard and that a lot of people wanted him to go to? Could he be a guy who makes a jump in this game? I think that's something that Ohio State could really use from him, is kind of that third option at wide receiver. We don't really know right now if Bryson Rogers is even going to play in this game after he announced last week that he's going to enter the transfer portal. They haven't really gotten a whole lot, from the depth at wide receiver. We'll see what Quincy Porter's status is. He missed the last several games of the regular season with an undisclosed injury. But you think outside of Jeremiah Smith, Carnell Tate, who's a guy who could make a jump? Brandon Inniss would be a guy that I would watch for there that, Ohio State would certainly like to, get more out of on the offensive side of the ball. And, I think defensively, certainly you look at, the obvious guys again, and guys like, Caleb Downs, Sonny Styles, Arvell Reese, I think is a guy who I think is great as he's been this year. I do feel like the second half of the year was kind of quiet for him. I think he had only 8 tackles in Ohio State's last 6 games. So it feels like he's due for kind of another big game, the game-changing kind of performance. I think if it had been Texas A&M, he would have been probably the first guy I would have circled, because he would have been so crucial in stopping that running threat of Marcel Reed at quarterback. Carson Beck, not as much of a runner, but I still think you mentioned it earlier, Chase. The defense has been kind of vanilla in most games. You figure CFP game plan going to be more exotic. You think you got to figure Matt Patricia is going to have a lot of things that he wants to do with Arvell Reese. And then, Kenyatta Jackson's another guy who, I think he really came along in the second half of the season, really became more and more of an impact player as the season's gone along. It's another guy who's from Miami Gardens, Florida, the same city where Miami plays its home game. So another guy you'd think is going to have some extra motivation in this game and a chance to build off of what was a very strong finish to the regular season.
Yeah, it's interesting the stuff about Arvell because his performance, the way that it kind of coincided with how the national media had kind of started to take notice of his performances and had elevated him to this number one overall prospect in the NFL draft, in some instances having him go number one overall in mock drafts at this point. To see that his production wasn't exactly where it was earlier in the season, my question becomes, how much of that is schematics? How much is that him not being unleashed by Matt Patricia for whatever reason? You can look at Fernando Mendoza, the way Ohio State talked about him leading up to that Big Ten championship game. Ryan Day also always made sure to say that he was an athletic quarterback. He was somebody that could move. He was somebody that could escape the pocket. So was maybe there a concern there that Fernando Mendoza could slip loose and get chunk yardage on Ohio State, so they weaponized Arvell Reese more as someone to neutralize the running threat of Fernando Mendoza? And in the same way earlier, as I had mentioned, that Ohio State wanted to make Bryce Underwood a quarterback in that game, in the Michigan game. And could they just use Arvell Reese as someone that would neutralize his running ability? Now that you're facing a quarterback who doesn't have that much of a threat in the run game, are you going to see Arvell Reese schemed up in more blitz packages, maybe allowing him to run a little bit more free in this game? And I do think, too, given Mark Fletcher's impact on the game against Texas A&M. I will be curious to see how Ohio State operates up front on the defensive line. Will they be operating more to keep contained and keeping him from moving outside of the tackles, forcing him into Caden McDonald? Or is Caden McDonald going to be such a threat where you're going to see Miami try and run outside of those tackles towards a Kenyatta Jackson, towards a Caden Curry, and guys of that nature? The way that they look to attack Ohio State's defensive line is going to be something that I'll have my eyes on as well. Andy, I want to ask you this question from Cloudtown Buckeye. He asks first, will Michael Irvin have any sleep between today and the upcoming game? I don't think so. He was an entertainment factory on the sideline for the Texas A&M Miami game. But the
Always
more
is.
intentional, more Ohio State focused question is this: what are your thoughts, Andy, in this game for the approach to the red zone? Will we see Ohio State use more passes to the star wide receivers, some looks for Lincoln Keenholes, more Bo Jackson, more five tight end sets? What's your view on how Ohio State should look to capitalize on Miami and score touchdowns rather than field goals in the red zone?
It's a great question. First, I did want to give some, context to the talking points because I was curious with Arvell Reese. So I went and looked up some of the PFF stuff and the numbers they have. So his pass rush reps did decline slightly in the last 5 games for really the last 7 games actually for Ohio State. Only had 4 pass rush snaps against Wisconsin. Never had 10 or more after that. Again, this is per Pro Football Focus plays where he rushed the passer against Indiana. Only 6. So I think something maybe to your point there, Chase, about using him more in that quarterback spy role, quarterback mirror role, whatever it is. And I think his pressure rate has still remained decently high, although he actually hasn't recorded a pressure since the Penn State game. So I
That's
think
crazy.
Arvell not getting home as much, not being sent as much. So yeah, definitely a trend to watch out for there against Miami. But going to the red zone issues, I don't know what to expect, frankly. I know what I think would be best, and I know what Ryan Day has talked about, and Ryan Day seems to be very open minded in terms of fixing the red zone issues. He admitted that it's been both a schematics problem and an execution problem, and a lot of it does come down to execution. I do think the 14 personnel packages definitely haven't worked that well outside of like maybe 1 yard to go, goal to go at the 1 yard line type of deal. And even then, Ohio State's had its inconsistencies. I really, for me, I think the most obvious thing in this for short yardage and the red zone is Lincoln Keenholz has got to be the guy. If you're going to call a quarterback sneak, it's got to be Lincoln Keenholz. And I don't care, like if the defense might know that's what he's coming on the field to do. And if they all bunch inside, then you can have him check to something else at the line, or you could dial up something else in anticipation of that. But Julian, for all the great things he does at quarterback sneaking is not one of them. 2 games in a row, we saw him against Michigan and against Indiana essentially hit the ground when he didn't have to, short of the line to gain. I mean, he just went straight down to a knee on what really should have been a fourth down conversion, a crucial fourth down conversion late in that game against Indiana. Um, and again, I don't want to sound too critical of Julian. The guy's a Heisman Trophy candidate and does so many things well in the passing game. But for sneaks, he's not good at it.
To your point, Andy, I
And
do want to say just a
I,
quick point. Like in the NFL, there are teams that just bring their tight end over and take these QB sneaks, and that's there's no secret as to what they're trying to do. Mark Andrews does it for the Baltimore
yeah,
Ravens. AJ Barner does it for the
The
Seattle
Texans did it
Seahawks.
with Cade Stover a
The
couple
Texans
times.
did it with Cade Stover. There's all these teams trying to replicate the tush push, or even just trying to get those crucial yards of the quarterback sneak, where they bring in a tight end. They don't even bring in their backup quarterback. So Ohio State has a guy that could check to something. To your point, they could, if there is something where Lincoln Keenholz sees a look. Hey, I might not get this yard, this 2 yards. I'll check into a pass. I'll do something else. It gives them that versatility.
yeah, exactly. So that's the most obvious change that needs to happen for me. And maybe it is like running a tight end in to take the quarterback sneak instead. But Lincoln Keenholz if it's going to be a quarterback because the guy is just a much better runner than Julian, much more powerful, knows how to keep his balance better. And he's just going to be more reliable getting that yard, I think. Broader, like, I don't think you should have. I don't think there should be any plays where both Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate come off the field. It wasn't. It was extremely rare that both of them were off the field, but on a lot of plays, at least one of them was off the field in the red zone, right? I think it was 9 of 15. That was the number. Plays where at least one of them was off the field. I think it diverts so much attention away from the middle of the defense when you have those guys on the outside that you know can go and make plays. Um, for me, I think one thing is I think Ohio State's used a goal line fade or two too many times. I'm an opponent of the goal line fade just in general. I think it's just chucking up a 50-50 ball against any corner worth his salt. It's a 50-50 ball still. And you say Jeremiah Smith might turn that into a 70-30 under a lot of circumstances. On the goal line, it's different. It's just not enough space to create that separation. It's a classic football play, but I think it's a very overrated classic football play. So that's just my personal opinion. I would run more creative concepts to get guys open in the middle of the field, maybe in the seams, maybe space. Uh, the he had going into halftime against Michigan was a beautiful design where they basically ran a double slant route with him and Max Clare. Clare cuts off the second level defenders with naturally with the slant route, and Ennis comes wide open, breaking over the middle. And so, like more designs like that find creative ways to get guys open if you're going to throw the ball inside the 20-yard line. And then when you run it, I think you can be more creative there too. Like we saw a reverse of Jeremiah Smith. I don't know if it was inside the 20, but it was near the 20 earlier in the season. That would have gone for a touchdown if defender doesn't split two blocks, right? Like more so to get other guys involved in the run maybe in game doesn't have to be Jeremiah, but some of the straight up gap scheme stuff in 13 and 14 personnel, I think maybe needs to go a little by the wayside because it's just not what this team is good at inside the 20-yard line, clearly. Um, Still have to run the ball inside the 20, but maybe find some more creative ways to do it, even if it's just some different schemes with your running backs. So, to sum it all up, I think you had to be more creative scheming the ball, more Carnell Tate and Jeremiah Smith on the field, if nothing else, than to divert defensive attention, and Lincoln Keenholz is your quarterback sneaker if it's going to be one of your quarterbacks, if you're going to involve the quarterback sneak.
I have a question. I'm curious if you guys could give me the answer. I'm going to guess that you might not be able to because I can't rack my brain about when it might have happened. But when is the last time you saw Jeremiah Smith run a slant? Because I don't know if I've seen him run one in a really long time.
He's run He's run spot routes. He's had
Hmm.
several plays he's made on spot routes, which are similar. I mean, it's kind of like a concept that you run where you stop right on a spot where it's but it's more to go against zone coverages where you find that hole, you spot up in it. Um, but yeah, I can't recall. Definitely mesh routes.
Yeah, a lot of mesh.
Mesh routes
Yep.
are more common in Ryan Day's offense anyway. That's kind of modern scheme. Yeah.
I'm
So
curious though,
no,
with his
a true slant,
physicality and
I
his
don't recall the last
size.
time.
Yeah, with his physicality, his size, I'm curious if that's something that could be an option as well. I understand your point about the 50-50 fade ball. I would trust Jeremiah and Carnell in those situations. I think that's worth a look. But I do think too, with Jeremiah's physicality, just his ability to create space with his size and his strength, is that an option that also opens some things up for Ohio State's offense as well. I got a couple of questions coming in from our YouTube chat, particularly about the offensive line and its ability to block up against Miami. Philip Daniels, going all the way back to week one, Dan, he had a great performance against Colin Simmons. Is he somebody that you would expect to have a good performance in this game, given Miami's weapons on the defensive line, Ruben Bain, some of those guys? Is that somebody that Ohio State needs to step up in this one?
Yeah, absolutely. Because yeah, I mean, I think there's going to probably be a lot of Ruben Bain matching up against him. I mean, I'd have to look at the numbers to see just how often Miami deploys him. On the left side versus the right side. But you would think, some of the struggles that Philip Daniels had against Indiana, and that right side in general, being the weaker side of Ohio State's offensive line. You would think Miami's going to try to exploit that with a lot of matchups with Ruben Bain over there. So yeah, I mean, I think Philip Daniels has had some great games. I think there's been some inconsistency in pass protection at time. I think the capability is certainly there for him to have a big game, but there's been some inconsistency. So, we're just going to have to see how it goes. And, again, some of that, obviously when people talk about, how much heavy personnel, how many multi tight end sets Ohio State's been using, a lot of that is focused on, passing the ball, but some of it's about pass pro too. I mean, how much will Ohio State need to bring in guys like Will Kacmarek and Bennett Christian to be extra blockers on the offensive line to help protect against those guys? I think, it's certainly something that's going to draw consideration in a game like this. I mean, you think back to that game against Colin Simmons, there were some times where Will Kacmarek made really big blocks to help allow plays to develop. You think of a one where he had a really good block on Colin Simmons as Julian Sanford's deep bomb to Carnell Tate for, I believe, a 40-yard touchdown. So it's going to be a group effort, as it always is on the offensive line. I mean, I think the good thing is something that can give you optimism as you think back to, we were just in this position a year ago. I mean, this was a year ago. The big question going into the CFP was the offensive line, because the offensive line had a really rough game against Michigan. A little bit of a different situation there because it was with, Seth McLaughlin going down with injury. Carson Hinsman had slid over to center. The first two games without Seth McLaughlin, Ohio State's offensive line didn't really seem to have that chemistry. But then they got some extra time to prepare for the CFP, and all of a sudden they looked like a new offensive line in the CFP. So they've had even more time to prepare this time around of having that first round bye. Have they been able to utilize those, or part of it still to come, those 3 weeks in between the Big Ten championship game and the CFP to really get that offensive line gelling? And I think that's going to certainly be a huge key in this game.
Okay, let's end our episode on this and talk about our predictions for the remainder of the CFP now that the quarterfinals are set. Before we get to there, I want to shout out or give a plug to, I should say, on 11 Warriors Dry Goods right now. If you need a Christmas gift, I know that Christmas is 4 days away. You can purchase a virtual gift card on the 11 Warriors Dry Goods website right now. There are values pre-marked 25, 50, 75, all the way up to $250 to buy some merch. It won't get delivered before Christmas. We can't pull off miracles like that, but we can ensure that once the product is delivered to you, you're going to love it. There's t-shirts, stickers, barware, everything that you could want, Ohio State version from 11 Warriors Dry Goods. So just want to give a quick plug to that before we talk about our CFP predictions. Okay, so we had on Friday and Saturday, the CFP results. Let's go through this maybe chronologically. That'll probably make the most sense to us. We have already all picked Ohio State to beat Miami in the Cotton Bowl, so we can move quickly beyond that. The next game that is going to be played is on New Year's Day. It's going to be Oregon against Texas Tech. Texas Tech was the number 4 seed in this bracket. They received a first round bye. Oregon played honestly a pretty entertaining game on Saturday night, beating James Madison 51-34. A nice little backdoor cover from James Madison in that one. Dan, when you look at this matchup, you see Texas Tech, you see Oregon. There are 2 logos there, one that we're probably accustomed to seeing at the top of the college football world, and a Texas Tech team that has taken this sport by storm a little bit this year. What's your read on how that matchup goes between those 2 teams?
Yeah, I think that's going to be the best game of a quarterfinals. I think those are 2 really, really good football teams. We saw that with Oregon, how explosive they can be offensively, especially with, getting some of their injured receivers back. I think, that's an Oregon offense that's got a lot of weapons. They're tough to stop. Did show some defense, some vulnerability on defense in that game against James Madison. And this is a Texas Tech team that I think, in some ways like Indiana, because again, they don't necessarily have a brand that's been associated with being one of the top teams in college football. I mean, really not since, the Mike Leach and Michael Crabtree days. They haven't really been a championship contender. I think they maybe get overlooked a little bit. Also, the fact they play in the Big 12 rather than the Big 10 of the SEC, but it's a really good Texas Tech team. And this is a team that they've been one of the best teams in the country on both defense and offense. I think particularly on the defensive side of the ball, David Bailey and Jacob Rodriguez are two of the best players in the country. So I see, this morning that Oregon has become a slight favorite in that matchup after its performance against James Madison. But I picked Texas Tech going into the playoff. I'm not going to change my pick now. I got Texas Tech.
Andy, is that how you view it as well?
Yeah, Texas Tech elite defense. Oregon's interesting for me because I don't really know. Still, after the Indiana loss, the toughest matchup they had was a home game against USC. They dominated some teams. They struggled against some teams, right? Only beat Iowa 18-16 on the road earlier in the year. Closed the regular season with a 26-14 win at Washington. Um, Beat USC by 2 scores, did blow out Minnesota, and then, like Dan said, some defensive issues. I think for me, the question with Oregon has always been up front. Indiana dominated them at the line of scrimmage in that game, and so they haven't really faced many teams that can punch up like Indiana can in the trenches until now. I think Texas Tech has a fantastic defensive front. Obviously, has one of the best defensive players in the country, period, with Jacob Rodriguez at linebacker. Um, so this matchup to me is, like Dan said, the best of the semifinals. Um, I am riding with Texas Tech. That was the pick I made, and I'm sticking with it. But uh, I I I think they have the line of scrimmage battle won this game, and that's what's going to decide it.
I'm also taking Texas Tech in that matchup. I will not be saving the graphic here, and I don't imagine that we'll be saving the graphic for this Indiana and Alabama matchup either. Alabama makes it in to face Indiana in this game, largely because Oklahoma just kind of gave them the game. They were up 17 to nothing at home. Oklahoma was over Alabama. And then they just had some miscues. They had a couple of special teams blunders. They had a couple of options where maybe they don't convert, maybe they turn the ball over. It just kind of it felt like Alabama was kind of able to steal that one from Oklahoma's hands and to get this matchup. I'm taking
Their
Indiana
punter just
here. I'm
dropped
assuming
on the
exactly
ground.
right. Yes, exactly right. There just kind of felt like it was Alabama
Yeah.
more so taking away the win than it was necessarily Alabama earning it. But I'm taking Indiana here. I'm assuming you guys are in the same boat.
I've got Indiana by multiple scores. I think Indiana again. We saw it a few weeks ago. It's a really good Indiana football team. I still think they're maybe not still getting as much respect as they deserve for how good of a football team they are. I think they have been the most complete team in the country this year. Yeah, I mean Alabama I think is number one in the 24/7 talent composite, and Indiana's like 70th or something. But Indiana's been the better football team, and I have no doubt that Kurt Signetti is going to have his team ready for this game. So I think Indiana wins by multiple scores.
That is the 4 o'clock Rose Bowl game. Then there's going to be the last of the four quarterfinals is going to be an 8 p.m. kickoff between Georgia and Ole Miss. Ole Miss reaches the Sugar Bowl with a 41-10 win over Tulane. It basically went the same way than when these two teams met earlier in the season. Ole Miss won that game 45-10. 41-10 is really not that far off. I feel bad a little bit for Tulane and James Madison in this scenario, both of those teams being group of five representatives, where these are two teams that are great for being in the group of five, but don't necessarily match up well with some of the other teams that are Power Five representatives at the top of this sport. There certainly needs to be, and this is a conversation for another time, another look at how this bracket's going to continue to evolve as the years go on. But we have Georgia and Ole Miss. Andy, you tell me how you think that matchup's going to go between the Bulldogs and the Rebels.
Yeah, this was my big upset pick coming into the CFP, and I'm sticking with it. I have Ole Miss in this game.
All right.
I think, yeah, Georgia great down the stretch of the year. Don't get me wrong. And this is a Kirby Smart team that probably not as talented as the two national championship teams, not quite, especially on the defensive side of the ball. But they've really found a rhythm as the back half of the year drug on. as they dominated in the SEC championship game, all that stuff. But I really think this Ole Miss team is playing inspired football. I thought after all that went down with Lane Kiffin, this is a team that could have gone one of two ways, right? You either come out and everything's disheveled and disorganized, everything looks like a team that just lost its head coach, or you had this very nasty breakup where all the players are pretty much seem embittered whenever they've spoken on social media about it, whenever they've spoken in public about it. It's the very like it wasn't like he was on good terms there. I really think there is that like sense of going to do it in spite of him, right? To me, I think how inspired they came out against Tulane, they went the other direction then, looking disheveled and looking disorganized. They came out motivated. They took the lead early in that game. They dominated. And I think you roll that in with the confidence that you can do it without Lane Kiffin, the motivation to prove that you can do it without Lane Kiffin, and an Ole Miss football team that had been pretty good throughout the year. This is a good and talented Ole Miss football team. I think Georgia is probably better, like all things being equalized, but I think the extra motivation, and then this is it's a purely emotional argument, I know. The extra motivation from the Lane Kiffin situation and what we saw last year in the CFP, less ring rust because you've already played a game in the college football playoff. I'm taking an Ole Miss upset.
Dan, is that how you view it, or are you picking the Bulldogs?
I've got Georgia. I think Ole Miss. Credit to them for a dominant performance yesterday. But did we really learn anything about Ole Miss yesterday? I say no. I mean, you mentioned it before, Chase. It was basically the same game that they played against Tulane the first time. I think the question of how is this team going to handle things without Lane Kiffin is going to really be answered in this next game because this game against Tulane, I think they were up 14-0 like 5 minutes into the game. Like Pete Golding didn't have to do a whole lot. It's a little bit different when you're a guy who's a first-time head coach when all of a sudden you've got to coach a team when they're in a deficit, when they're in a tight game in the fourth quarter. And so I think this next game is where Pete Golding's going to really get put to the test as the new head coach of Ole Miss. I do think it will be a competitive game. You look back to the game in the regular season, Georgia beat Ole Miss 43-35. So I do think this will be a competitive game. I think Ole Miss is really very much, because of all the things Andy talked about, they're very much the wild card in this CFP right now. Like, would it shock me if Ole Miss upset Georgia? No. But as Andy talked about, I think Georgia finished the season really strong. They've gotten better and better as the year has progressed. I do think that Georgia is a top 5 team in this playoff, quite possibly a top 2 or 3 team in this playoff. And so I am going to take Georgia, setting up a potential Peach Bowl rematch from 3 years ago and the Fiesta Bowl in this year's semifinals.
Yeah, then it puts us in a great place because Andy picked Ole Miss so confidently. Dan, you picked Georgia so confidently. And this was actually a game that I looked to pick Ole Miss as an upset bid just because I wasn't sure about what Ole Miss would look like with Pete Golding as the head coach. It did always surprise me a little bit how quickly, how swiftly Ole Miss moved to just promote him to the head coach. There was nothing about, we're not looking to kind of change anything that's going on here. We're just going to, Lane Kiffin can go to LSU. We're operating exactly how we have all season otherwise. I do think that this Ole Miss team is, as Dan said, the wild card. I will pick Georgia in this game, though. I think that Kirby Smart's experience coaching in this game is going to show up in more ways than one. When you have the coach that pretty much everyone can agree is one of the top 2. Many people would say he's number 1 coach in college football, going up against the guy who is now going into an interim role for a second game, his first and a very consequential one. I do think that that's going to prove to be the difference in that matchup. And I think that Georgia's defense will look a lot better than it did in the first matchup between these teams. Georgia did not get a stop until the second half. It was constant touchdowns for Ole Miss all the way through the first half. And then it seemed like, as Georgia has done many times this year, locked in at halftime and decided, okay, now we want to go win this football game. I think they'll come out with a little bit more motivation in this one. So let's go to the one that our Ohio State readers are going to care about the most. We'll go with the consensus here. Ohio State against Georgia in the semifinals. Dan, you just brought it up. This is going to be a rematch of a semifinals that took place a couple of years ago in the Peach Bowl. This one will happen in the Fiesta Bowl on January 8th at 7:30 p.m. in this hypothetical semifinals. If you see Ohio State and Georgia facing off in the Fiesta Bowl, Dan, who are you taking?
I've got Ohio State in a close one. I think that's what I had in my original picks, and I'm not making any changes from my original picks because all my picks won yesterday.
They're still
So
there. Yeah.
yeah, there's no reason to make any changes. But yeah, I've got Ohio State over Georgia at one. I mean, I think it'll be if it ultimately comes to that, it'll be interesting to see how both these teams do in the quarterfinals, and that might shape more of my actual score prediction later. But I do think that offensively, Ohio State is the more explosive team than Georgia. I think they're both, really good defensive teams, and I think that would probably be a low-scoring game. But Georgia doesn't have Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate, and I think and I also think Julian Sands better than Gunnar Stockton. So I think that's what would ultimately make the difference in that game. Is I think Ohio State just having the more explosive weapons on offense.
Yeah, and when we look at that matchup too, I agree completely about Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate and some of the weapons that Ohio State has. Andy, how much do you pay into sort of maybe this game being a defensive battle? Do you trust Ohio State's defense to get the job done against Georgia's offense in the same way that you would trust a Georgia defense to get the job done against Ohio State? Like, do we think this game could be a low-scoring game? Do we see it being more of a mid-tier or maybe even some sort of shootout? I'm leaning towards it being not a shootout because of how good these defenses are, but it could be a game where you're going to need to score more than 20 points to win this thing. Do you have confidence that Ohio State could get that done offensively against a Georgia defense?
I say, um, like seeing like those same issues crops up again. I do think though that I have faith in Ohio State's defense to hold the Georgia offense below 20 points. They might not need to score 20 points to win that game. Um, the Ohio State like Georgia's been inconsistent offensively throughout the year. You look back at the Florida game, which was played at a neutral site. You look back at some other games on their schedule. They've not had the best outings every week offensively. And you can say the same about Ohio State. There's been a couple games this year where they weren't operating at peak performance, mainly that Indiana game. Um, I just think Ohio State is like you have the best defense far and away in the country against an offense that's had its ups and downs. And so I am confident that Ohio State's defense um, creates enough in that matchup to where the offense just needs a few explosive plays. And like Dan said, I think Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate get it done. And I really think we could be in the midst of an exceptional run from those two in this 3 game college football playoff because not only are they going to be back to 100% for the first time in a while, they're going to be utilized more in a situation you can just all the cards on the table and you don't have to worry about trying to conserve health, conserve energy, conserve reps for the college football playoff because you're in the college football playoff. And we saw a lot of that last year from Ohio State when it used more of its offensive weapons in the college football playoff now that they don't have to worry about conserving those reps. So um, I think they're both in for a big CFP, and I think that they make the difference in that game of two really good defenses.
On the other side, we have the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl. It's going to be on January 9th at 7:30, or excuse me, at January 9th at 7:30. On that game, or our consensus picks would be Texas Tech and Indiana. Dan, I'll go back to you. What's your read on this game between the Red Raiders and the Hoosiers in our hypothetical matchup?
Yeah, I think that could be a really fun game because, again, I mean, you talk about two teams that I think both rank in the top five nationally in scoring offense and scoring defense. So I think that could be a fun matchup. But, just seeing what we've seen from this Indiana team, how consistent, how dominant they've been, I do give the edge to Indiana in that one.
I'm also going to take Indiana in this game, though I did pick Texas Tech in our previous matchup. And here's what I would say about Texas Tech. I'm feeling a little nervous after I submitted my bracket about Oregon in this game. I'm curious what Oregon could do to give Kurt Signetti and Indiana a look at this Texas Tech team. I know that they only played James Madison, but I do think that with Oregon getting healthy, it does seem like a matchup that could catch Texas Tech off guard. I do think, though, that Texas Tech, it would not surprise me if they knocked off Indiana in the semifinal game for one reason, and that is their ability to force turnovers. They are forcing a turnover. I believe they've played 13 games. They forced 30 turnovers in this season. That is an incredible rate. That's well over two a game that they're averaging, and their turnover margin is also exceptional as well, ranking in the top five nationally. So my heart is torn on this one. It was the one that I felt maybe the least confident about when I submitted my bracket. So maybe I should stick with my heart on this one. I'll go back and forth on it over the next 10 days until this game takes place or whatever it takes place on January 8th or January 9th. And it is something, a matchup that I'm very, very excited to watch because both of these teams are exceptional. And I think that that matchup is going to be great. Andy, I believe you had Indiana picked in this game as well. So let's go to our national championship and our hypothetical bracket, which is a rematch between Indiana and Ohio State in the national championship game. Does Ohio State complete its quest for back to back national championships by beating the only team that could beat them in the 2025 season? Andy, I'll start with you. Ohio State, Indiana, national championship in Miami. Who do you have?
Ohio State. We've submitted our brackets. I picked Ohio State there. Nothing's changed. You gained no new information about Ohio State and Indiana in the last, obvious first round, and those were my championship game picks. I think they're the two best teams in the country. Dan said it after that Big Ten championship game in Indianapolis that the national champion played in Indianapolis that night. It's just which team. And to me, I do think Ohio State really suffered from a lot of self inflicted wounds in that Indiana game, whether those were schematic, whether those were in execution, um, some whiffs in pass protection, a really bad game from the right side, especially the offensive line, but the offensive line as a whole. Their worst game of the year, far and away, in pass protection, and it was the best defensive line they had played. Credit to Indiana. Um, Stephen Daly being out, I think, makes a big impact because I don't think Indiana's depth at that defensive end position is to what Ohio State can bring off the bench necessarily. Not that it has to worry about that right now. Caden Curry and not Caden McDonald, nose guard there, brain fart. Caden Curry and Kenyatta Jackson Jr., of course, are healthy, but I just don't know how good that next guy is going to be compared to one of the best run defenders in college football and Stephen Daly and a guy who's pretty good rushing the passer too. Um, I take Ohio State in this game, and I think there's going to be some new schematic wrinkles when they've seen each other once, and Ryan Day has a chance to install some of the things. Again, the extra time, because you get extra time every game now, at least a couple extra days to prepare for these. I do think that will also have an impact for as much as like the transfer portal is going to be going on too. Ryan Day's ability to really oversee and do what he did in last year's college football playoff and fix those schematic issues and come up with great game plans to attack some of these elite defenses. So I'm taking Ohio State in that game, in that hypothetical game, and I might even be tempted to take scores. I just think that revenge element is going to weigh a heavy factor, and having seen them once, and I do think they're the slightly better team overall, all things being equal.
Dan, what about you?
Yeah, I've said it before. I picked Ohio State to win a national championship. I think that if Ohio State plays up to its ability, it's the best team in the field. I think, Ohio State at its best is better than anyone else's best. And so that's why I am picking Ohio State to win the national championship. In terms of a hypothetical matchup with Indiana, I mean, I wouldn't say that I have a high degree of confidence in picking Ohio State to win that game. It's probably just a little bit over 50% because of how that first game went and because of how much respect I have for Indiana, how good I think that Indiana team is. But I do think that in the rematch, I mean, you've heard Ryan Day say it a couple times now, where it's like we have players like you can tell that Ryan Day feels like they should have won that game, and
Yeah.
that they didn't coach well enough, they didn't execute well enough. That if they had played the way they were supposed to, they would have won that game. So I think Ohio State would go into that game with a better game plan. I think they would learn from the things that went wrong the first time around. I think they go in with a lot of confidence that they can win that game, and I think they would. I would pick a close game. I mean, a score prediction right now, I'd be probably thinking somewhere in the ballpark of like a 24-20 kind of game. A little bit higher scoring than this past game. Still two phenomenal defenses, so not a huge scoring game, but I think it'll be a little more high scoring, and I think Ohio State's offense would be a couple touchdowns better than it was the first time around.
Yeah, 24-20. Man, that would be anxiousness, nerves, anything that you can come up with. Ohio State fans watching that game go down to the wire if it were that close. I would also pick Ohio State in this matchup, and it's exactly what Dan just said. I think Ohio State at its best is the most talented and the best team in the country. And I struggle to find the reasons why I have hesitancy to pick Ohio State with confidence in any of these matchups. It really comes down to the Buckeyes beating the Buckeyes, is kind of how it feels. The reason that Ohio State wouldn't advance past a Miami, past a Georgia, past an Indiana to win a national championship is if Ohio State commits the self-inflicted wounds or the errors that would then keep them from winning the game. Julian Sand can't turn the ball over on the first possession in these games. Ohio State needs to be efficient from start to finish. They need to be able to run the football. They need to be able to execute in the red zone, and they need to be able to assert their dominance on defense. And all of that comes down to, can your players execute the game plan that you have created for them to have success? And I know that we don't really talk about him anymore here around these parts, but Jim Knowles, one of the things I always appreciated about Jim Knowles was how he laid out the consequences of actions on game day. If a player makes a mistake in practice, it's on them. If a player makes a mistake in the game, it's on the coaching. And can you trust Ohio State's coaches to have these players ready, to have seen everything that they need to see to have success in these games against the three opponents that they would face en route to a national championship? And I'm confident that with a win or go home mentality, that they would have that mindset and that they would have their players ready to execute at the highest level and to win these games. As much as I would love to say that Ohio State's players were 100% fully focused on winning a Big Ten championship game, I have to believe that there is also just a little bit of doubt in the back of their minds about, does this really matter? Should we go all out for a Big Ten championship, which of the three most important goals at the beginning of the season are to beat Michigan, to win a Big Ten title, and to win a national championship? And I think all three of us, I think anyone in Buckeye Nation would agree that the least important of those three is the Big Ten title. And I'm not questioning their drive, their desire to win that game against Indiana, but I do think that there's just the human element, that there is a little bit of ability here. Okay, if they lose the game, does it really matter? Now, there's none of that. Now it's, you have to win or you go home. You have to win or you don't get remembered. Or in this case, you might be remembered as one of the greatest Ohio State teams that didn't win it all. And I think that's what's going to drive this team to have success in the playoff and to ultimately win back-to-back national titles. So we do have our consensus pick is still Ohio State to win it all. I'm the only one experiencing some conflict along the way in this bracket about whether or not my initial picks were great. Dan and Andy are extremely confident in theirs, 100%. They told me off the air. I'm just kidding. They're extremely confident. But this has been a great episode. Great to talk to you guys again for the first episode of 11 Warriors Live since the Big Ten championship game. Or actually, no, it was a live show that we did for the Sharon Moore News. But then before that, it was after the Michigan game that we've talked Ohio State football. So it was good to get back in the chairs and talk with you guys again. Want to give another quick shout out to buying a virtual gift card from the 11 Warriors Dry Goods store. You can get those available now. And also want to give a shout out to First Bank of Central Ohio, who has sponsored our videos throughout the year. Dan and Andy, I will talk to you guys soon. And the audience, we will talk to you guys soon. for another round of 11 Warriors Live. Until then, take care, folks.